This episode is supported by Eurochild.
What are children's realities in Europe? Read Eurachild's Progress and Gaps report, examining the state of poverty, social exclusion and governmental efforts in 31 countries, and see what can be done to respect, protect and fulfil children's rights.
Today in the EU-US trade, what EU economy ministers fear about second Trump term. European economy ministers are meeting today to discuss the future of EU-US trade relations. However, with Europe's economy lagging behind that of the United States and the prospect of a new Trump administration, the task appears daunting. How will EU economy ministers address the challenges of managing trade relations with the US amid escalating geopolitical tensions? What might be the implications of Donald Trump's proposed trade and monetary policies, such as new tariffs and a pivot towards economic protectionism on the EU and its member states? With key industries like Germany's automotive sector already facing significant pressures and the risk of a broader trade war on the horizon, how is Europe preparing to adapt to a shifting US trade agenda? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Kiorri, and this is Today in the EU. To find out more on this, I spoke with Euractiv's economy reporter Thomas Nielsen Moeller. Hi Tom, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello.
So today European economy ministers are meeting to discuss the future of EU-US trade relations. But before diving into the details, let's address the elephant in the room. The US still hasn't appointed Trump's new trade secretary. So how will this timing impact today's discussions?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that this meeting is coming at a time of, rising geopolitical tensions and literal wars, either on the European continent or close to the European continent. So obviously there's the war in Gaza, there's the war in Lebanon, there's a potential war between Israel and Iran. There's also obviously the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has been escalating quite dangerously over the last few days.
Right, and everyone is fairly concerned about all the geopolitical tensions. But on trade, what are the biggest concerns for the EU?
On top of these sort of geopolitical tensions, there are also trade tensions, and they're not totally unrelated. So right now, there are certainly rising trade tensions and geopolitical tensions between the US and China. There are tensions between trade tensions and geopolitical tensions between the EU and China. And there's also, on top of that, rising trade tensions between the EU and the US. Now, the flagship policy of Trump's campaign, or one of his main flagship policies, was this promised tariff, universal tariff of 10 to 20% on all US imports. And on top of that, there would be a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. And this has given rise to two concerns among European policymakers and European businesses. So the first one is that this universal tariff will sort of directly impact EU exporters to the United States. Now, it's worth mentioning that the EU currently runs a large trade surplus in goods with the United States, which means the EU sells more to the United States than the US sells to the EU.
And who do you think, within the EU territory, of course, will be impacted the most by the tariffs Trump has already announced?
So this would directly impact the European economy. It would particularly impact Germany. So one of the EU's top exports to the US is cars. And I think listeners are aware the German car industry is really not doing very well right now.
We talked about it last time.
We talked about it. There are two reasons for that. On the one hand, there's slowing demand in China. Basically, Chinese consumers don't really want to buy or are less willing to buy German cars than they used to be. And related to that is the fact that Chinese car makers are becoming much more competitive, like BYD, Geely, these sorts of brands are competing, particularly in the electric vehicle market. And they're, in many ways, people say, superior and cheaper to what Germany is producing. So the point is, this universal tariff will directly impact the EU, and in particular Germany, which is Europe's manufacturing powerhouse and largest economy, whose economy is already suffering. It contracted last year, the German economy, and it's set to contract again this year. So that's the first concern. The second concern is the 60% tariff that Trump has pledged. This has worried European businesses and European policymakers for a slightly different reason. The fear is that right now China and the US, they do a lot of trade. The idea is if the US implements these steep tariffs, all of these goods that are going from China to the United States will be redirected and potentially dumped on the EU. And this could force the EU to implement tariffs of their own, additional tariffs of their own against Chinese goods, which in turn could lead to retaliation from China and so on and so forth, and spark a kind of a broader trade war. So those are the immediate concerns that EU officials will be discussing. One thing about Trump, which is obviously worth noting, is he does say a lot of things on the campaign trail which don't turn out to be true. So I'm old enough to remember his campaign for president in 2016, where he famously said, we're going to build this wall and we're going to get Mexico to pay for the wall. Obviously, that didn't happen. So
right, and following what you were just saying right now, can the EU really take Trump's threats at face value?
Look, the fact that he said that he'll implement this 20% universal tariff and 60% tariff on Chinese goods, that might well not transpire. However, a former US trade official I spoke to said that although it's not clear what exactly Trump is going to do, it's almost certain that he's going to do something because he's extremely suspicious of trade surpluses or other countries having trade surpluses against the United States, one could say.
You know what's very tough? European Union, our beautiful European countries, wonderful, wonderful. If you add them up, they're almost the size of us. They treat us so badly. We have a deficit, and we're not going to have them anymore. We're going to put tariffs on them, and they're going to do, and you know what they can do? The Mercedes-Benz will start building in the United States.
Has clarified in the past the newly elected president of the US, Donald Trump.
And that's a major concern that he has. He, in particular, he regards this as a form of sort of job stealing. They're selling more to us than we're selling to them. That's unfair. We want to bring those jobs back and make those goods that we're purchasing elsewhere. We want to make them in the United States and make jobs in the United States.
And you mentioned your interview with the former U.S. General Counsel to the trade, Greta Pischt. What was the sentiment that you got from your chat with her on the upcoming policy the White House will follow on trade? Of course, you mentioned that we don't know yet the specifics, but maybe there was something there between the lines. The
sentiment I got is that whatever happens, there's been a big shift in the US's trade policy, certainly since the first Trump administration. The US is now extremely concerned about China more than anything, I would probably say. And the reason why there's been this kind of shift in the US trade policy, economic policy, away from sort of more open markets to greater protectionism is largely for security concerns. They're worried that their industries, their manufacturing has been outsourced to China, which has happened over the last several decades, and they want to bring this back. And the way they think that they can bring this back is through greater protectionism, so through things like subsidies and tax breaks for manufacturing firms in America, and also through things like tariffs. So there has been this shift. And one thing that Ms. Pischt said to me is, look, a lot of EU officials think that, they were sort of hoping that after the first Trump presidency, or the first Trump term, that Biden would snap back to the Obama term and the Obama presidency, where again, there's a kind of better ties and more open economic relationship, trade relationship. And she says, no, that's changed. The US policy has undergone a fundamental shift. These aren't her words, but the message basically was the US is more protectionist and it's going to stay more protectionist. And the European Union needs to recognize that. In terms of specific policies that she expects, again, we don't know what exact measures Trump is going to introduce, but he is focused on the Europe's trade surplus with the United States. He's going to do something to address that. Now, one thing he might do is he might reintroduce these tariffs on steel and aluminium that he introduced during his first term, which annoyed a lot of European leaders. In fact, Europe responded with retaliatory tariffs of their own. This kind of dispute was suspended. There was a kind of moratorium on it carried out under Joe Biden.
The United States is our biggest economic and trading partner. We share a unique historical bond, and our citizens share millions of friendships across the Atlantic.
Mentioned last week, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
But that suspension is going to end in March next year, so 2 months after Trump takes office. So something could happen there. There's also another concern. So there's this so-called Section 301 investigation that was completed by the U.S. Trade Representative in 2021.
We will get back to this after the ad.
Children face many challenges in Europe, including inadequate mental health services and insufficient investment in the early years. We need to remove these gaps for a fairer present and future for all children. Read Euractiv's latest report, Children's Realities in Europe.
basically the idea was the US would impose retaliatory tariffs on EU products because of the EU's desire to tax US tech firms like Google and Apple and things like that. I think this is not something that Ms. Paish said, but I think it's a real concern. Obviously, Trump is extremely close to Elon Musk. They're now, I don't know, something like best friends. Obviously, he's a bit of a tech mogul. There is a fear that these tariffs that were suspended could be reintroduced going forward. A name that I think listeners should be aware of is Bob Lighthizer.
Who is that?
So he was the former U.S. trade representative he was the trade representative during the first Trump term. He's an ardent protectionist, fully supports the use of tariffs. In a recent op-ed in the Financial Times, he described countries that consistently run large trade surpluses of the United States as predators. And he says, you're the protectionist, really, by running these trade surpluses against us. Basically, you're taking our jobs. And reportedly, he's been offered the job of trade representative again. There are rumors that he wants a different position, maybe Treasury Secretary or something like that. But he's going to be very influential in the next administration. That's something that Ms. Paish also confirmed, that yes, whatever position he has, he's going to definitely influence the thinking going forward. I should also note that Ms. Paish, she worked for a Democratic Senator, Ron Wyden, during the first Trump administration. So she's a Democrat. Lighthizer obviously worked for Trump, but she is very clear that she admires him and regards him and praised him. She praised him for basically shifting U.S. trade thinking and economic policy. She said he moved the Overton window. Basically, he moved the spectrum for what can be regarded as feasible within the domain of trade policy going forward. So he's going to be very influential. And I think the fact that he will be part of the next administration, I think is something that's also making a lot of European policymakers extremely nervous.
And speaking of European policymakers, and going back to the meeting of the economy ministers, what are the main points that they will bring into this conversation? Is the EU ready to sit and have these conversations on EU-US trade?
Well, I think ministers, what they'll likely be discussing and what I've been told they'll be discussing is sort of broader strategy about how to deal with the Trump presidency. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting of European leaders in Budapest, and Ursula von der Leyen said that what Europe will do going forward is to buy more liquefied natural gas from Russia. And just to take a brief step back, Europe is not buying as much pipeline gas from Russia as it used to. It's buying more liquefied natural gas. The US is now the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It's also worth noting that Trump in 2018, if you remember, when at a NATO conference, he blasted European leaders. He said, "What is this? You are continuing. You're saying you want me to protect you, and you're buying a ton of gas from Russia. Like, what is this? You want our protection, and you're doing this. That's absolutely not okay." I think there were two reasons why von der Leyen mentioned LNG specifically. One is that the US is the largest exporter, but it's also, I think, we're doing what you wanted us to do. We're buying more from the US, and we're going to cut down our imports of LNG and pipeline gas from Russia. And the broader strategy from Europe is kind of a tit for tat, but the idea is initially to cooperate and be very conciliatory, to say, yes, we want good trade ties with you. We want to cooperate, so we're going to try and be nice. In the commissioner hearing a couple of weeks ago, Maris, I'm going to butcher his name, but Šefčovič, I've been told is how you pronounce it. Šefčovič is how it looks, how it's spelled. But he's the second longest serving commissioner. He will be the longest serving commissioner soon. He basically reiterated the strategy that the von der Leyen subsequently confirmed, which is, look, we'll be nice to the United States. If they retaliate and impose tariffs, we'll impose defensive measures of our own. But the idea is initially the Europe strategy is to be more conciliatory and then respond appropriately depending upon what the United States does. That's the strategy, and I expect what they'll be talking about later today is kind of just confirming and clarifying what that strategy is going to be. There is one other thing that I think maybe should be noted. People are talking a lot about Trump's trade policy, which is totally understandable because his promise of 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, 20% tariffs on other goods, that's obviously something that will scare a lot of European leaders. But he has also spoken quite a lot about monetary policy.
Right. So then what about Trump's monetary policy?
So one thing that Trump has said before is that he wants a weaker dollar, Why does he want a weaker dollar? He wants a weaker dollar because if you have a weaker dollar, it'll make U.S. exports cheaper and therefore more competitive. And that's something that is concerning a lot of European leaders, or should concern a lot of European leaders. It's certainly concerning some analysts I've spoken to as well. Right now, the general consensus is that the U.S. dollar is overvalued. It has become stronger since Trump's re-election. This is a little bit more technical, I suppose, but the reason for this is that investors think that Trump's tariffs are going to be inflationary. It's going to lead to a rise in prices for goods in the United States. And that'll mean that the U.S. Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank, will have to keep rates at a higher level for longer, which strengthens the dollar. Anyway, Trump has said before that he wants to weaken the dollar, and it is something that he could consider. He was Jerome Powell, who is the head of the U.S. Fed. He was asked, would you step down if Trump told you to step down? And Powell's term is supposed to end in 2026. And he said at a press conference a few weeks ago, he just said, no, I'm not going to do that. It's interesting. Powell was also installed by Trump in 2017, but Trump is very critical of that. That's another thing. It's monetary policy, but it would have a big impact on trade going forward. And I think, in my opinion, it's something that European leaders should consider or should take into account. I think a little bit more. But the interesting thing about this is that Trump, he's also spoken a lot about the dangers of de-dollarization. He doesn't want other countries to stop using the dollar, because if they use the dollar, then the US will be able to impose sanctions on them if they need to. And the fact that other countries still continue to use the dollar basically allows the United States to maintain its dominance over the world's financial system. The risk, obviously, is that if he devalues the dollar, this might mean that investors that hold dollar-denominated assets abroad will be less willing to purchase these assets or to hold these assets in future, and that could accelerate de-dollarization. So Trump is in a bit of a bind about this. And I guess, long story short, I think this is also something that should be considered, and it's a potential policy move that I think Trump might actually could potentially make a move on.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much.
I am Evi Kiorri, and this was Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. You can get in touch with us by leaving a comment or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us a lot to spread the word about our work, but also understand what topics you like listening to. This episode was produced by Miriam Sainz Tejada, Charles Cohen, and me. Thank you for tuning in, and until tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.